Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a short essay on Lisa Käll's article, A Being of Two Leaves, in which she interprets Merleau-Ponty's notion of the lived body. I find this an interesting article and worthy of some conversation because of the way that it plays with the body as lived as part of our identity and how that identity is both indeterminate and yet bodily. And so I want to play with these concepts of identity, body, and lived body to think through what it is to be a lived body, right? To be a human being with this lived body. So Käll starts her article off with thinking about the body as both the grounds of identity and also something fundamentally indeterminate. So we often identify ourselves through or with our bodies, and yet there's something that we cannot say that often escapes description within trying to talk about the body. Bodies themselves are also produced in spatial and temporal contexts as bodies of determinate types. So the two pictures on the screen here are from the television show Altered Carbon, which is a science fiction show. And in this show, consciousness is dropped into bodies. It's put into a body on basically a fat flash drive. And so individual people can change what they call sleeves or bodies. And these two bodies in front of us on the screen are inhabited by the same consciousness at different times. So in fact, the consciousness here of Takeshi Kovacs, our protagonist of the series in the first season, is originally in the body on the left, right? So Takeshi Kovacs has a specific ethnic name and what people might call specific ethnic features, and we can discuss at other points whether those are in some sense defined by the body itself, and that's part of what Käll is trying to raise when she talks about the body as lived. But in the show, through most of the show of the first season, this consciousness is in the body on the right, which is a very different type of body, right? And we can even talk about other features of the body in terms of strength, in terms of height and weight, and those sorts of things. And in the book series, actually, there are various ways that bodies can be enhanced so that the body is felt even more differently, changing between sleeves. And so I think it's interesting to think about the body in the context of this television show because of the way that the body is in many ways separated out from the identity, right? And so when the consciousness comes into the body on the right, the person wakes up and he's unfamiliar and why does he look like this, et cetera, right? Why does he have these kinds of features rather than those, these abilities rather than those abilities, et cetera, or when he goes back into, actually he doesn't, in the first two seasons, does not go back into the other sleeve. So that the relationship between the body as a ground of identity and something fundamentally indeterminate is thrown into question by this science fiction series. And yet, what I think is interesting about what Käll does in this article is she puts back into question the possibility of downloading our consciousness into these different kinds of sleeves, to use the term of the television show and the novels, because the body is such a part of our identity, even if it's not everything we might think of as ourselves. So part of what's going on in both the article and in our lived experience, and in the television series, is the body is both subject and object. And these are distinctions that Merleau-Ponty makes and part of the phenomenological tradition. So the subjectively lived life, is the consciousness. We're aware, we have intentions, and then our consciousness is fundamentally incarnate. And I think that is an important contribution that phenomenology makes to understanding of human identity and human meaning in contemporary philosophy, something that's really forgotten after the medieval period, and the body is sort of tossed around and not important. And we come to connect back with ideas about the body through phenomenology in the modern period. Another way, of course, of looking at it is as an object. It's a physical thing. It's something to be observed. And we ourselves observe our own bodies. We might notice a cut on our body or some other physical thing about our body, and it becomes something that we observe. It's also observed by others, whether that might be the doctor or someone we're passing on the street, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this double aspect of the body. And Käll brings us out through the kinds of discussion, through the kinds of discussion that we might get with Merleau-Ponty's example of the leaf, right? So the leaf has two sides, okay? And on one side, the sunlight is shining, and on the other side, it is not shining. And yet the leaf is still one leaf. And so there's a part of it that is open to the sunlight and a part of it that's hidden from the sunlight. And yet the open part would not be part of the sunlight if the hidden part was not also there, and the hidden part would not be there if the open part, the part open to sunlight, was not there. So each side is constitutive or conducive to the being of the other side. And similarly, there's the example of a person touching her or his two hands together, right? And so one hand touches the other and the other is touched, but at the same time, the touched hand becomes touching and the touching hand becomes touched. They cannot be both at the same time, right? So you can be aware of your right hand touching your left hand, right, as the right hand touching the left hand being touched, or you can be aware of the left hand touching the right hand being touched. But you can't be aware of the right hand touching and touched at the same time, or the left hand touching and touched, right? So we flow back and forth in this experience as we rub our hands, for example, as we wash our hands or rub lotion on our hands, right? One is touching the other and the other's touching the one, and back and forth, right? And not both at the same time. This becomes the foundation of perception, knowledge, and reflection, right? So how we experience our bodies touching and interacting with other bodies provides the basis through which we perceive, not simply in terms of touch, but in all of our perceptions, right? And of course, we know with modern science that all perceptions are, in fact, involve some kind of physical contact, whether we're smelling something or seeing something or whatever, right? But this touching, this bodily perception leads to categories of description and analysis. So if we look at the leaf there, we see sunlight but darkness, or we see it as see-through, we see it as soft or hard, right? And same thing with the hands, right? One side of the hand might be softer than the other side, or might be firmer, or it might be rough in some places and soft in other places, or something in between, right? And so we become to mark specific features and qualities which determine how to name a specific body and how to make that body visible as an object of experience and knowledge, okay? So knowledge itself is grounded in our perception of the physical, which is part of our bodily experience. So we live that perception, right? And I think it's important to pay attention, if you have a copy of this article, to the footnote on page 113, where she talks about different ways of thinking about the two sides of the coin, right? Two sides of the leaf, right? So there's inner experience as mind versus the outer perception of the physical thing, the specific body of existing person, and the impersonal body thing of science. So different ways of thinking about what we're trying to do here. Now, these two aspects of the body cannot be coincident, right? We can't experience both at the same time, and that's important for understanding what our knowledge is and for what our experience is, right? For experience is always a relation between the experiencing and the experience. So here we have a picture of the superhero Groot, and this is from the movie Avengers. Sorry, I was going to say Age of Ultron, Endgame, and Groot has turned part of his arm into an axe, and he's about to chop off that part of his arm, right? So now he is experiencing part of his body as something, and so he's relating to that as a particular kind of experience, right? So the arm is being experienced as, and he is experiencing the arm as, etc. Right? If the body was completely reflexive, so that we are experiencing the experience at the same time, then the body is no longer a part of myself, right? Then we fall back into that kind of dualism that phenomenology is trying to escape, the dualism that we associate with Descartes, where there's a separation between mind and body. And so this idea of the lived body is getting away from that, and that's part of what our experience is. Now, of course, what happens is that the body is both an experience of myself and of others, and so it is this self-relational activity that establishes categories of identity, but also goes beyond those categories, okay? And we often try to resist those, okay? So there's the body image, right, which can be our own understanding of ourselves, but also that understanding is going to be wrapped up in the understanding of the body that is dominant in the culture or cultures that we belong to. Okay, and so we give meaning to and categorize the body, right, as lived in relation to the ways that it is signified. Okay, so our meaning and our identity can be wrapped up in even if we are resisting that kind of identity that the dominant culture wants to impose upon us. So here we have the interiority of the subjective life and the exteriority of naming and categorizing. And of course, as part of that culture, we do name and categorize, right? Which means that we are in some ways internalizing those names and categories, but that also allows us to resist the categories within the dominant culture, right? And again, in understanding this body as a node between the interior and the exterior, right, we are transcending the mind-body dualism, and we are denying that the self is something separate from nature. Now, part of what that means is that we are embodied in the world as particular kinds of bodies. And so Merleau-Ponty talks about the stick that the blind man walks with is no longer separate from the person. It's part of his body. So because my body touches and sees itself, it can also touch and see the world. That's part of our experience as lived bodies, but then the tools are incorporated into our embodiment so that much of the world is part of our bodies as well. Now, I said this was important for understanding our identities and how that body is also indeterminate. So there's this subjective experience of myself, but in understanding myself, I'm also intersubjectively accessible to others, right? So Harry Potter's scar on his forehead means something for him, right, that is different to what it means to others. And he only becomes aware of that meaning to others when he enters into the magic world, right? And then it becomes something, it defines his identity differently. And we see that change in himself as he defines himself against the Death Eaters and everything that goes with the Death Eaters, right? But we also see that in the way that we categorize our own selves. And so the body becomes both a site for inscription of social cultural norms and the values that I incorporate, but it also becomes a way to deny that body norm, right? And that's part of what Käll is trying to get at here, right? She's saying that if we want to engage in social critique, right, then what we have to do is we have to understand ourselves as embodied in this both sides, subjective and objective. And we see that in recent discussions of Billie Eilish, where she was out in her tank top, as if that's a terrible thing, right? And so what happens here is our identity becomes pulled into the meanings that are inscribed with our bodies, but also the ones that we allow to be there, in which we ourselves accept. But of course, it also becomes indeterminate because as soon as I start to name my body, I realize what is not captured in that name, what is left out of that and left out of my identity. And so I think thinking of that is very important.